All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. My name is Luigi Alcañeses. Today, I've been instructed, and I have the opportunity to give a lecture on how to give an oral adjudication. And this is for the purposes of UADC 2025 lecture series. So, specifically, I'll be doing this in the context of Asian parliamentary. But I think this lecture will also be applicable for other 3v3 formats, particularly World Schools or Australs. To those at UADC, good luck and have fun. I'll get right into it. So, when we are going to create an oral adjudication, oftentimes, there are a few reminders that you have to have in mind before you actually make the OA. The first is that throughout the entire round, you should already be expected to have at least a very clean copy or close approximation of your notes of what happened in the round. Which is to say that you should have an accurate source of your own understanding and your own retelling, your own tracking of what happened in the round. And so that could mean a few things, right? It means that you need to often take note of the details of certain arguments word for word in the way in which a team said it, especially the most important mechanisms when they are explaining it in the argument. And also, too, you're also taking note of like highlighting certain portions that are very, very, very easily related to other parts of the debate, particularly in portions where they're responding to a point and you know what specifically they are responding to, or your own notes and understandings of what is happening at different points in the debate, such as if they give a particular case study or use a particular example and they use that as analysis in an argument, then you want to be very clear and you write down in your little notes right there saying, what is the extent to which I credit this example as related to the argument? And then you move on. Okay? So, notes, this lecture will not work if you don't have good notes. And you need to have a system as a judge to already refer to arguments in a round and easily refer to a lot of other details that and events that happened in a round, like particular very contentious points, like POIs that were raised, responses to those POIs, the implications of such. You can't recall everything from thin air when you're giving an OA. And in the same way that you can't give an OA without your notes, you also cannot give an OA just completely reading verbatim what you did in your notes. So that is why, you're not a transcriber, right? You're not like someone that's writing every word for word from the entire debate and then you're just gonna you're gonna say all of those words when you give the OA, and then you're gonna say, well, this team said this, blah, 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 and then you're like very legalist about it, and you're saying, well, they didn't specifically say this, and that's why they lose. And then you always refer back and forth to your transcript only. In the same way that you're not gonna be like, you go into an OA, and then you're saying, well, they said this, but, they actually probably meant this. And then you just pretend as if the argument was fully built, even though it empirically was not. So the notes should be really good early on. The second reminder for most judges is that you do need to, before giving an OA, you should already have some tentative decision that you have already made throughout most of the round, or you have some decision that has been revised, revisited while the round has been ongoing. Which is to say that when you have your, maybe 5-minute deliberation time or 10-minute personal deliberation time after the round is done, you already have sets of questions in your mind thinking, well, did they really say this? Like, let me just revisit whether they actually proved the context. Let me just revisit whether or not this response was actually valid enough. Was there any preemptive stuff that first speaker said which I am missing out on when op-whip already came up in the debate? Like maybe op-whip is missing out on particular arguments that were already established, and so I want to correct for some recency bias. So you have a decision. And that decision should be some tentative working, like it's a working draft that you are eventually fixing during your deliberation process. And that should help you accurately produce whatever OA that you want. And so, having said that, I'll get right into the discussion for what I want to do for today. What I want to do for today is to focus on, you know, what you should focus on in an oral adjudication, because you could spend 51 minutes to 1 hour, explaining an entire debate and retelling it part by part. But as we know, right, you only have 10 minutes. But also, if you are saying so much stuff about what happened in the debate and your speech time is exceeding a whole lot of what already happened in the round, then you're probably already stepping in and building too much than what was already said, or you're saying a lot of unnecessary stuff that doesn't get to the meat of whether or not a team won or lost. So there are two basic requirements that an OA should do. The first basic requirement is you only have a maximum of 10 minutes, which is to say that you have to have a clear structure or time management plan in your head when you get into the OA. Every debate's going to be different. Some parts have a chain of responses which are, very, very, very intricate. Like there are even if responses, there are worst case responses, there are responses that are tied to certain assumptions, which you also have to break apart as well. And so in your mind, you're gonna be thinking, well, this issue is quite important. It's very, very, very critical to the debate because not only did teams spend a lot of time on it, but it's very obviously critical to whether or not I credit a certain argument in the round, because that response is tied to a certain outcome or a certain mechanism or a certain impact. And so no OA is always going to be 1 minute introduction, 3 minutes per issue, and then you do 3 issues. No, that's not going to happen. Never going to happen. What is most often going to happen is you have to look at the debate that happened. You will inevitably have to cut off a lot of stuff, and you will have to explain at the beginning of your OA why you are focusing on these particular contentions the most. Because if you were gonna literally try and cover every contention, every clash, and every idea, then you're literally going to go over an entire debate. And that is not what we want. We want you to be a very smart judge, like that has already thought through every contention and every clash, and you've sifted through the unimportant ones and you've looked at the important ones, and you know how they're related to each other, and then you have the OA. That's what the condensed decision is. The second basic requirement is you need to be straightforward with the reasons why you made a team win, which is to say, again, even within every clash, every contention, you are always trying to highlight, summarize, and evaluate. Those are all different things, by the way. Highlight means to focus on this particular part of what they are proving, and you are focusing on that particular contention with respect to the responses other teams gave and the counter responses other teams provided against those responses on that particular claim. And to summarize is to say these responses essentially boil down to the implication, which is blah, 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 blah. And then you explain saying that this is what the response was aiming to do, which is why you are summarizing it, the function, the objective of that response, and what it essentially does. And then you proceed to the last step, which is evaluating. You evaluate and say, okay, given that this response was now provided, and given that there was no counter response specifically against this claim, the extent to which I credit this response is blank. And then you explain why that is critical to why a team won or why a team lost. There are many pitfalls that happen when you are doing the OA, like in the actual process of giving the oral adjudication. And I think many beginner judges will be familiar with this feeling wherein you have a lot of notes, you don't really know what to do, and when you give the OA, suddenly you run into the problem of I am I am saying so much. I am wasting a lot of time. And I am using up so much time. I can't do this in 10 minutes. It seems impossible. And the reason why that is likely to be the case is because you might be wasting a lot of time repeating, rebuilding, and reiterating too much of what the team said. I think let's give an example, right? If a team provides reasons as to why, let's say, colonialism created inequality that lasted across generations, and then they provide a lot of contextual reasons. They say, well, firstly, because of historical inheritance inequities. Number two, because of political dynasties and how they have entrenched themselves in power. And number three, because colonialism also hinders the development of minority groups. And you're in the OA, right? You know that the function of that particular portion is just essentially saying that colonialism created a lot of inequalities. And so if you are trying to look at, for example, a response opposition provides, which is saying that, well, we want to move on from these anti-colonial rhetoric, and we want to reconcile ethnic divisions and create a new ideology. When you're in the OA, right? You're not gonna say, well, government side provides 3 reasons as to why colonialism created inequality. Number 1, number 2, number 3. Opposition went up and then started to explain that it's important to have healing and we want to be able to resolve ethnic divisions in society. There's no need to try and repeat everything in that issue because you have to go and dial down in the part that is contentious, which is, yes, government side did explain that there is an inequality that is created by colonialism. And so now you have to assess whether or not that inequality, right, given that it is historical, is maybe mediated or is reparated by the process of using anti-colonial rhetoric. But now, when you look at it with respect to opposition, you're not going to say, well, I have to evaluate whether opposition's claim on ethnic divisions specifically defeats the argument on inheritance or political dynasties and all of these other inequality stuff, because that's not a contention. That's not a clash. And so there's no need to go through all the details in that part. You just have to go to the part which is saying that opposition is contesting the assumption of Gov, which is that these historical inequalities created a lot of deep resentment and anger, and that is why anti-colonial rhetoric will be effective, and it will allow them to satisfy that anger. But, so the claim is, it either satisfies the anger, or opposition, it will, enrage it more, and make it worse. And so, now we have to have healing. So that's the question that you're looking at. There's no need to go through all the 3 reasons, or all the spammy stuff that teams might say, especially if it is relatively uncontested in the round. Number 2, oftentimes a lot of judges, when they reach the end of evaluating an issue, they end up deferring to vague platitudes such as, I just thought a team was more responsive. I thought that they tackled the worst case a lot better. Or I thought that they fulfilled their role more because they explained the problem and they gave a solution. And then, you say that the other team had no comparative and that's why they immediately lose. Remember, the reason why you want to, before the OA, right, come up with a lot of questions in your mind and a lot of contentious points where there were significant disagreements that are related to the motion. The reason why you are trying to break up those questions is because you want to come up with a concrete basis that is grounded in what happened in the debate, right? Remember, saying that a team is more responsive or they're just more comprehensive, right? That is merely just an opinion insofar as you watched the debate. You're a judge and you said that, yeah, I thought they were just more responsive. But it's another thing to say that they were successfully able to debunk the claim, which is XYZ, And given that they debunked that claim, it is relatively more true that XYZ is true. And that is why they win this issue. And that is why they win the debate. Because their arguments were contingent on that issue. There's a very significant difference between saying that a team is just trying to be more charitable versus giving the concrete basis that they were more charitable because they gave an even if response that said this, and I credit that response because it explains XYZ, and that is why it was valuable to the debate, whereas the other team had no specific response against that counterclaim, and that is why they lose the debate. Okay. The last pitfall that a lot of judges have is that they often don't know how to differentiate whether a team is like clearly winning or whether they are like it's a close engagement. Maybe they just have a feeling that yeah, it felt close, or it felt that it was kind of clear because they were very good debaters. But again, those are all feelings. You have to be concrete. And the starting point to trying to correct that habit is that when a team wins an issue, you want to always clarify the extent to which they won that issue, which is to say, you have to be clear with how much you credit. Like you say, this argument is true to the point in which it says blah, blah, blah. And that discipline will stop the pitfall of when you make a team win, suddenly they start winning everything. Right? Like the problem judges might have is that they say that, oh, the team won first issue, and then they go to the second issue and say that, opposition did this, government side did this, but government side still wins because they won the first issue. And then the government side also wins because of all this other stuff, and then you start trying to justify why government side won, which means that you end up whipping for them. And then you say, well, I can't credit all the responses of opposition because it just doesn't seem that true, and because government side has a strong response which is all on this blah 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 blah. The reason why you might end up having language like that, or like phrases where you end up trying to defer to your own judgment of particular responses, is that you're not being concrete enough, right? You can't just say that a team was more persuasive and then say that they won because they're more persuasive. What you need to do is that you need to explain, okay, this is what they're trying to do. This is the attempt and the underlying objective of this response. And so, for me to break this deadlock, I have to assess whether or not they were successful in specifically comparing this analysis against the existing argument that government side presented, which was XYZ. And so, let's look at the analysis that was provided by each team. Gov said this, opposition said this specifically against that. And so, at the end of this issue, what I believe and what is clear to me is that the implication is blah, 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 blah. And that I would say, in generality, right, still is an assessment, because that's the judge assessment, right? You are assessing whether or not it was sufficient enough. But you have a concrete basis. And so you're not just going to say a team automatically wins, or that they're winning because they have better responses, and then you just stop there, right? It's not about having better responses. It's about having the response which was specifically necessary against a particular argument. So having said that, I'll go to the last part of this brief introductory lecture. The last part is, these are the things you should do in an OA, especially if you're like a starting out and you're like maybe you were recruited into your college team, and then they're making you judge, and you want to be a very, very good disciplined judge. Like, the best starting point is that you have to take better notes. You have to have a better understanding of what happened in the round, and you have to keep on trying to track particular details so that you could revisit those notes and try and understand what happened. And you listen to yourself, how you justify it. You try to justify it, you practice over and over. And when you do many, many OAs like this, you watch many, many debates, and you have lots of notes and lots of systems that you've developed, like heuristics, like how you can credit an argument, how you are tracking response against a response, you will get better as a judge. And so this is what you should do in a competitive setting, in a tournament. The first thing that you should definitely do, especially in Asian parliamentary, wherein a lot of teams might not remember you, especially if you're a panelist, they might not remember your name specifically. You want to be clear. Introduce yourself and immediately give the decision. You can give maybe one general comment that you thought was critical, but 99% of the time, it is often better to just go, introduce yourself, say your name, give the decision. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi Alcañeses, and I was a panelist for this round. I thought this was a great debate, and the decision I gave was to make the government side win. Next, outline the reasoning for your decision into different questions and contentions. This is what I was already saying a while ago. So how would you say that? There are 3 specific contentions which I based this decision on. First, how did teams characterize the incentives of X stakeholder? Second, what mechanisms were more dominant in assessing whether Y impact would happen? And third, which principled framework was proven to be more inherent in the motion? Remember, guys, these questions and contentions, the more specific they are to what happened in the debate, the better. Because you don't want to go into a round saying, well, I'm going to assess the debate based on whether conflict happens. Or you say, I'm going to assess the debate on the deadlock of the principle. Or you're going to say, I'm going to assess this debate on the pragmatic outcomes. Right? Never, ever do that. It is almost always better to be specific and say, there is a clash which was on the issue of blah, 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 blah. Let me now assess whether or not they gave the underlying claims to prove whether that context was true, or whether there was enough analysis to explain whether or not this impact would happen or this outcome is more likely to happen than opposition's claim. And then you move on from there. This is the most important bullet point that I want to highlight for this one, that in reality, what you want to do at the end is that when breaking down each question, you should briefly highlight the most important claims within that contention. You should assess attempts at response from either side, and then consistently turn back to your thinking process as you evaluate the extent you credit these claims. I do emphasize that you have to think like a biblical scholar. I like that analogy a lot, because a biblical scholar, right, you have notes in front of you, which is your oral tradition, your written tradition based on the oral tradition, which was the debate. And that is your retelling of what happened in the round. That's your source material. You have your own instinct that you remember, but you have your basis, which is your notes. And what you will then be doing is that you're going to be highlighting specific parts, hopefully in the language that the team specifically used and the way that they analyzed the argument, and then comparing that against the other claims that other teams gave in the specific way that they also explained it, while you are continuously summarizing and evaluating it with respect to the evaluation-related questions that you will be asking based on what this means in the debate. So there will be claims, there will be counterclaims, and you don't want to be always limited to just literally reiterating. That's what I said a while ago. But you are almost always trying to filter, condense, clarify what it is. You want to tell the teams, guys, I listened to you guys. I know what you guys said this. But really, at the end of these issues, this is really what I am getting. And so I'm now evaluating that against the other teams, what they said specifically with respect to that. And now let's go and clarify and compare who's winning this issue. So this is how it would usually look like. Government side made the argument ABC as contingent on the incentives of X stakeholder being blah, 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 blah. Based on this incentive mechanism, ABC impact would happen, and this was argued to be important in the context of blah, 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 blah. Opposition specifically responded to this by providing some response. DEF response, the response was on blah, 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 which I credit only to the extent to which it concludes that blah, 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 blah. Now, the question at the end of this first contention is whether or not these responses were sufficient in weakening government's claim so that opposition can comparatively prove the counterclaim that blah, 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 blah. So remember, guys, when you say that someone successfully disproved another claim, remember, you are always trying to be comparative. You're always going to compare and say, well, what does that mean? What is the function? What's the purpose of this? Given that now this is disproven, is there another claim that is now being forwarded in response to this? Like, as mutually exclusive to this claim being true or not. And so you highlight what happened, you highlight the implication, you highlight the response, you highlight the counter response, and you keep on going back to what was preemptively said and the implications of that in the debate, to the insufficiencies of certain responses. That is sufficient enough. And then you say, having said this, there are a few specific reasons as to why I made government win this contention. Now let me go and evaluate it. Here are the things I'm specifically going to say. And then this part, I will admit, it does involve some part of your opinion, right? Your opinion on whether or not a certain assumption was well proven or not, or whether a certain claim was proven or not, whether or not a response was more effective than not in some particular likelihood, or with respect to a certain metric that you are using, like, the extent to which it impacts a certain community that is proven to be very vulnerable or whatever, right? It doesn't matter that you are having an opinion, because judges should have opinions. But what matters is that you are being as concrete and evidence-based while you are saying your opinion, which is that, okay, given that they've said all of this, given that the counterclaims were this, here are the specific questions I will now ask as to whether or not I believe, or whether or not government actually proved this contention or this incentive to be true, or more likely to be true than not. Number one, they said this, and this specific claim had an underlying claim that was proven with respect to this. Opposition did not contest that specific part, so I believe that this is relatively more true. With respect to other claims, this means XYZ. Move on, move on, move on. Lastly, when you're done, right, given that government side wins this contention, what does that mean in the debate, right? You always want to re-highlight what the big picture is, right? Like, to win the debate, you have to prove this assumption, you have to prove this context, you have to prove this mechanism, this impact. This is the extent to which this impact should be true for you to win the debate, because that is your win condition, as stated by your own arguments, but also by the way in which you weighed those arguments with respect to a problem in the debate. And then you compare that against other teams' explanations as to why this issue might be critical to their ways of winning the debate as well, because there are multiple ways teams could win the debate. But specifically, winning a contention contributes to the big picture. And that's what you're essentially doing. All right, I'm going to end now. What I'm going to be doing now for the rest of this lecture is I'm going to show you one sample OA that I've provided before, and then you can watch that, you can listen to that. I'm going to highlight certain portions that I thought were most important. Probably going to pause maybe 3 times along the way, and you can now review that OA and, analyze it and think about the language, the phrasings, and try and incorporate some of it if you think it would be helpful into your own OAs too. But otherwise, that's it. I'm gonna go and proceed to go and give this sample right now. So the motion that was used for this particular debate, the motion was this. It's in Australs, but I think it applies a lot here as well, because the only difference is that it's affirmative and negative, and it was 8-minute speeches, and there were no POIs. So there's no mention of POIs in my OA because there were no POIs in Austral's format. But a lot of the different habits of doing issues, the structure of it, I think it's a very, very good OA that I've given before. So I'll give that example now. So the motion was that as a reigning F2 champion with no promised F1 seat, we would choose to race in a different series, overtaking an F1 reserve seat. For this OA, I was provided with a dilemma, which is that, well, there are some arguments with respect to the actor, right? The actor on what their personal dilemmas are, their motivations, what their frustrations would be like. And there were also arguments related to, like, whether or not you would actually be able to meaningfully leverage your position. And so in this OA, I'm very, very, very careful to not let each issue bleed into another. I want to be very clear the extent to which the incentive analysis, right? The motivations, your obligations, your ideas, your own interests, how can they stand as their own argument? But how much of that is also contingent on other arguments in the debate, such as your frustration also contributing to the fact that now you are not going to be a good team player, now you might get less opportunities, etc., etc., and that is why it might be worse for you, right? So those are two relatively separated but somewhat similar issues. Here's where I try and tackle that. I'll play this now, and we'll move on from there. All right, game. Let's begin. I'm gonna mute up, and then you guys can proceed. So hello everyone, welcome back to the round. My name is Luigi, I was the chair, and with me was Jerry. Thank you for the round, very, very good job on both teams. It was a negative win on a relatively clear margin. And I will just proceed to explain this under two simple questions. So the first question I will explain is, will this actor be able to have sufficient opportunities that they can necessarily leverage in order to have more bargaining power within an F1 team? And number two, on the motivation specifically, is this actor willing or able to stomach the uncertainty of being an F1 reserve driver and all of the baggage and the difficulties that comes along with being an F1 reserve driver? So I will note on the second issue, before I go on to the actual meat of the issues, is that I do think that the principle of chasing your dream and the principle of self-actualization from AF did not immediately necessarily engage with one another, because I would say the chasing the dream principle didn't explain why it should come at the cost of the immediate trade-offs of the frustrations of not being immediately in the F1 seat. And at the same time, I don't think the self-actualization principle necessarily immediately engaged with the fact that, are you able to also compare that self-actualization with the self-actualization you might get in being in the F1 environment, or the milieu of being in an environment of a team that is trying to win in an F1 series? And so I think that the reason... So just to pause here, the reason why I spend maybe 1 minute 30 seconds on that particular introduction is because you might encounter this in a round, right? There might be arguments on, well, you have to do this because it is your obligation, that you want to chase your dream. Chasing your dream is important in and of itself. But remember, that conclusion, right, does not only stand alone only, right? There are other functions to that idea, that chasing your dreams is somewhat limited, right? That there's an argument which is you will be frustrated and you might not always get to chase your dreams. So there's the argument which is that you have the incentive and you have a motivation to chase your dreams, that you should chase your dreams. But there is the argument which is that, well, what if you are not also able to sustain the motivation to chase your dreams? So here, you want to be explicit in the OA, right? You're saying that, yeah, I acknowledge some parts of this argument, but I also acknowledge that this argument is somewhat limited to a certain extent. And I want to be very disciplined and clear as to how much I'm crediting this argument before I go on to the issues part by part. As to why I only credit the motivation arguments, like the frustration ones, the principle ones, only to the extent that the context is convenient for your own arguments. It's all eventually boiled down to whether the opportunities are existent, or whether you can leverage that within the organization, because all of those impacts eventually are contingent on you being frustrated because of less opportunities that you don't see it, or that you don't chase your dream because the fact is that you would otherwise feel like you could get more competitive prowess or more fulfillment in being in an alternative organization afterwards. So the first issue is necessarily more important. Having said that, there are a few things that are compared in the first issue on the opportunities. Affirmative's explanation is that there is nepotism and there is pre-existing leverage from incumbent drivers within the organization, which are inherent barriers that make it very, very difficult for even the best F2 champion to be able to compete. Additional reasons that come from this is that they explain that there are many other similar actors like you who are also in the similar age bracket, who there are other individuals that are having more potential in the next F2 seasons over and over. So it's either you get success immediately or you are doomed to being a specialized reserve driver for a very, very long time. Now, I will admit that I think that the underlying explanation behind this nepotism, pre-existing leverage of incumbent drivers, and that you diminish your skills over time, the necessary assumption behind that is that you, as a reserve driver, will not get more improvements in your competitive advantage over future F2 champions and the relative potential that they can experience. And I hope you are catching what I'm doing here, because I explained what the argument is, the goal of the argument, which is that it is going to explain that you lose your skills and that you are going to essentially like fail and not become successful. But I ask the question, this must be compared against any potential relative prospect of you to improve your competitive advantage if you were already in the environment of an F1 reserve team. Because the assumption is that you aren't doing anything. You're not racing in a competitive context. Obviously, there's something different if you're placing a different series and you are actually the front runner. But, you know, even if the teams didn't highlight it all the time, right? They're not super disciplined in saying that, okay, I have to compare it every single time. You as a judge have to be explicit, because obviously you're not just going to credit the claim and say that, well, they're going to lose their skills, and then you stop there. No, you have to compare that claim against another potential counterclaim that might potentially happen, because there's an assumption behind this argument. And so you have to assess whether that assumption stands or doesn't. And so I'm about to do that right now here when I bring in Negative's explanation. So I think it was necessary for Negative to be able to debunk that assumption in order for the argument to do. And my answer is Negative does break that assumption in a few key ways. The first key way is that they explain that, well, yes, we agree that there are many inherent connections. You have to build these connections and your reputations over time, but you can do this within a team dynamic and through working with the engineers being in this environment. This is flagged at first speaker, but also emphasized at second, wherein being able to know the ins and outs of the sport, working with the technology and the specialized, like similar technology with F2, which you're already familiar with, this is existing base experience that you can build on, which proves to other individuals and actors, other teams as well, that you are worthy of having chances in opportunities that you can leverage on your own, even if they are limited in number, but also relative to other actors who are also facing the limited inherent difficulties of getting into F1, you will still be like the first option compared to anyone else the longer you stay in as a reserve driver seat. So the implicit analysis that that first speaker was giving here, that Negative was giving, was that you gain comparative leverage by staying in the organization. What's the response that Affirmative gives? Affirmative gives the response that, well, staying longer and longer in the reserve seat means that you lose your skills because you're not driving. You're not actually driving all the time. And actually, you might have the risk of getting an injury. Now, I think that this analysis doesn't necessarily engage with like the comparative difference between driving in NASCAR and other series where the technology and the environment is inherently different and your past experience does not necessarily translate into future experience, nor do I think that it also responds to the fact that you are already building connections and reputation within F1, which you could build because you are a disciplined team player. Now, there's an implicit analysis that... So I'm gonna highlight here that right now, we're in the middle of an issue, right? we're evaluating whether or not it is true that you losing skills comparatively because you're not driving, right? Whether or not that is a sufficient enough analysis that beats the claim on comparative leverage, which opposition is attempting to claim. And so now I'm trying to be very charitable to affirmative when I'm saying that, okay, now let's look at any implicit analysis that would evaluate whether or not you are specifically able to like fail. Like, will you fail more in opposition, that you will not really get the comparative leverage, that there's like a link, like there's a link that is being broken? Like, is there anything that they gave that could potentially contribute to this issue? That's what I'm searching for, which is why I'm looking for implicit analysis, because they might have said it, they might have said something, and I want to credit it to the extent that it is valuable in the round.
Affirmative gives in addition to this, which I like and I do credit, but I don't think it's necessarily leveraged that much. Like the argument affirmative gives is that you become more frustrated in the reserve position. Therefore, the more frustrated you are, the less you are able to focus on the getting better as a driver within F1, and that's why you become less of an option. So the longer you're as a reserve driver, the more likely they'll just get someone else to just immediately be promoted over you. Now, I buy that. I buy this analysis. I like it. However, I don't think that it is explained as to why this is relatively less preferable than you comparatively feeling frustrated in a separate league wherein you might not always get success, which is not proven, but also that you are going to improve in the specific way that you've designed your career before. And that's where I think, to be fair, the second issue comes in, right? So the second issue is on the motivation and the way in which you can deal with these uncertainties and the mental health difficulties and all of that. Affirmative's argument in this particular portion,
I just wanted to pause here, and maybe some people might be very confused. Like, wait, Luigi, aren't you just making the mistake of now your first issue is bleeding into the second issue, and that you've completely forgot to conclude the first issue? Well, here I want to be very disciplined, right? I want to say that, oftentimes, you will encounter debates where like some big claims do bleed into the other smaller claims, which is why sometimes breaking it down into issues might help, because you are able to delineate the conclusions in certain parts to another, but you do want to be clear as to what parts were contingent. And here, definitely, we do know that the comparative leverage part does contribute to the personal frustration part. So actually, what the objective was for this OA was, first, in the first issue, prove that they did explain that the opportunities would be available, and that that itself is a very, very important issue. But secondly, even if the opportunities were not always available, is it necessarily valuable to the actor that they are making this trade-off, they're taking the risk to be an F1 reserve position? And so that's essentially like trying to cover enough bases to be comprehensive in the debate, because arguments do tackle both, right? They might tackle both at the same time, but as a judge, for you, you have to be the one to help sift through it for the sake of the debaters, because this is obviously very important to the round. Like, you need to evaluate the actor incentive part, but you also need to evaluate the actual contextual part, which is whether or not you will succeed or whether there will be opportunities. So those are two separate contentions, which is why it might definitely be the case that I made a skip, which is that I go to the personal incentive part. But we've already finished the first issue by this point anyways, because we've already established that, well, since we have established that affirmative's response is only contingent on the potential frustration that you might eventually experience, that potential frustration doesn't negate the actual opportunity existing or not, that there is potential for you to get better and improve, because the F1 team has incentives to provide you with those opportunities. Now, whether or not that's related to you actually being motivated, that's a separate issue. And that's why you move on to the next one.
is that you have an obligation to your fans, to your family, to be able to drive to self-actualize because you're doing something you really, really love and you want to improve no matter where you go. They love you because of your personality and your character. Negative response here is that you have lots of more, a deeper obligation to your dreams. And that is why even if you might not immediately be successful, you should at least try, because that is what facilitates your obligation to yourself, to your family, and to everyone else. So in this particular deadlock, or in this particular exchange on the principles and the motivations, I do think there is an engagement, which is the engagement of your perception of your potential success and whether that motivates you and can you generate motivation from this. And in this analysis, I will say the first issue builds onto the second issue up here very nicely, which is that the prospects of more successes and opportunities being available to you does build more motivation and more commitment to the organization over time. And that is where you can leverage a sponsorship, you can get some money from this, and you will be a little bit more fulfilled, even if you're not winning all the time, and even if you're not driving all the time. But on the comparative, I think affirmative has a few rungs of ladders to jump through in order to meet the bar of this particular engagement of that fulfillment, that nuanced fulfillment that negative is trying to reach, which is that you have to be in an alternative series. Because you're an F2 champion, you will automatically be successful relative to everyone else, and you will get motivation from that. And that inevitably translates to more motivation for you to feel that you are doing the thing that you've always wanted to do your entire life. And I don't think here there's an analysis as to why your past preferences, your historical preferences, the way you designed your life in F2 can be immediately shaved off just because you like the fact that you're driving all the time. And there is an analysis from first here about you have to win the champion, and it's the biggest social comparison for you no matter what. I don't think that analysis is symmetrically applied to being in the alternative series, which is why I don't think that this motivation itself immediately means that the mental health problem or those frustrations outweigh everything that they would otherwise experience in that process. So because of this, the TLDR again is that I think that to the extent that the principle is not immediately engaged upon, it is not explained why those opportunities will be available, how they can leverage it, but also why the alternative series would always be more meaningful in addressing those social comparison problems that those people will face. For those reasons, decision stands. If you have any questions, you can ask Jerry first, and then you ask me afterwards. Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
I just wanted to say a few things. The first thing is that when you're giving an OA, remember that you cannot say everything. And so you have to focus on saying the most important contentions that everyone did talk about during the round. Usually, if they focus on it a lot, then that would be a good indicator for you to focus on that during your OA. But there are also parts where you have to be very critical, where you have to be critically minded and have to evaluate things on your own. And you have to navigate certain contentions and issues through the way in which it was concretized in the debate. And you're gonna find a way. You're gonna find a way, and you should find a way to be able to evaluate that with respect to certain metrics that were floated in the debate. Right? People might give some principles, people might give some weighing mechanisms, people might give certain proofs to certain ideas. And so it is now your duty to be able to evaluate that side by side to the best that you can. And if there is very little response, then what you are really eventually doing is you look for any material, you squeeze water from stone like a biblical scholar, and you explain the limitations of you crediting certain ideas. And that, more often than not, is quite good. And I'm quite happy that a lot of people are able to do that already. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Have a great day, and thank you very much, and see you. Bye-bye.